For weeks, this MiG-29 has been cruising low over the Black Sea from Kacha airfield in Crimea. Chasing down Ukrainian drones, the pilot's been busy intercepting, but tonight, the engines are cold, and he's catching some Z's. Meanwhile, 400 kilometers away, a weapon is already on its way to make sure it never flies again. The Russians have no idea. At 6 a.m. local time, a pneumatic catapult launched a UJ-26 Beaver drone off its rail, zooming into the sky. The rear propeller kicked in right away, lifting the drone to 60 meters before it leveled off and settled into cruise mode. So quiet that a soldier 500 meters away would only hear the wind. Meanwhile, 3 Ukrainian special ops soldiers had less than 2 minutes to vanish. They folded up the launch rail in just 12 seconds, tossed thermal blankets into the truck bed, and sped out of the field. A dirt track runs alongside an irrigation channel. The Beaver was already 2 kilometers away, climbing to cruising altitude, heading toward Kacha airfield, 398 kilometers southeast. But the Russians were on the hunt. Just 14 miles east, a Pol 21 electronic warfare tower picked up something unusual as soon as the Beaver powered on. This system covers the Nepo corridor with receivers that catch satellite navigation signals. The Beaver's encrypted GPS handshake sent out a quick frequency-hopping burst in the L-band, lasting only for milliseconds. A duty officer with Rubicon, Russia's drone crew, spotted something unusual: possible long-range UAV launch in the Surzhan sector. Minutes later, an Orlan 30 drone took off 6 kilometers away, scanning for the heat signature of a vehicle that couldn't have gotten far. Exciting stuff, right? The Beaver is climbing to 400 meters, and it's clear why Rubicon focuses on neutralizing operators instead of just taking down drones. With a 2.5-meter fiberglass frame, it flies at 160 kilometers per hour, has a tiny radar signature, and can maneuver low over tricky terrain at night. The Beaver drone is pretty much invisible to Russian air defense, but the operators, not so much. It takes months to train those drone crews in RF discipline and navigation. If you take them out, Ukraine loses way more than just a drone. The MiG-29 can be replaced quickly, but these skilled operators, not so easily. The 3 to 5 micron band can spot a vehicle engine that shut down 20 minutes ago. Heat drops about to see per minute, so the Ukrainian truck would still be visible for another 15 to 20 minutes. They parked in a collapsed barn, killed the engine, and covered the hood with thermal blankets, sitting in silence while the Orlan searched overhead. The truck had just been idling, and you could see the heat bloom on the grass where its tires were. That's when Rubicon sent out to FPV hunter teams. These drones are super effective. Each one weighs under a kilogram, flies at 120 kilometers per hour, and packs a serious punch. Taking out a vehicle's engine block is one thing, but the real game changer is having numbers on your side. A hunter team can roll with 6 to 8 FPVs, enough to cover a search area and force the target into a mistake. These drones fly low, blending into the terrain and staying quiet until they're close just 200 meters away. They headed west on a dirt track toward abandoned farms. Russian tactics expect drone operators to prioritize speed over stealth, but the Ukrainians played it smart. They hunkered down in a barn, holding their breath as an FPV drone zipped by. Meanwhile, the Beaver was 50 kilometers out, climbing silently to 800 meters, ready for its long flight. The operators had no clue where the drone was headed or how to steer it. They had to rely on the navigation system to get it into Crimean airspace, while focusing on survival. At 0616, the Orlan flew over a barn, but its thermal camera showed nothing: no vehicles, no people. The search was logged as inconclusive, and they moved on. Crimea on a heading that would take over 100 kilometers of open steppe. No terrain masking, no cloud cover, just composite airframe the size of a dining table cruising through radar coverage that extended 300 kilometers in every direction. And yet Russian air defense saw almost nothing. If you look at how the radar interacts with the Beaver's airframe, you'll understand why. Radar returns depend on the relationship between wavelength, target size, and aspect angle. The Beaver's composite skin absorbs and scatters radar energy rather than reflecting it cleanly back to the receiver. At grazing angles, when the radar beam hits the aircraft from below at a shallow angle, the return drops to nearly zero. Russian search radars operating in the span can theoretically detect a 0.0303 square meter target at 40 to 50 kilometers, but only if the geometry is perfect. The Beaver's flight path was calculated to avoid these geometries. The drone flew towards the Russian MiG on pure inertial navigation. Its GPS receiver still active, but not transmitting position updates back to the operators. The inertial navigation system tracks acceleration and rotation through inertial gyroscopes and accelerometers, dead reckoning the aircraft's position based on where it started and how it's moved since. The system drifts over time, roughly 30 to 40 meters per minute without GPS correction. But over a 400 kilometers flight, that error accumulates to less than a kilometer. Close enough for the terminal phase where the operator can take control back over. Back at the Rubicon Operations Center, analysts were running reverse vector reconstruction, or RVR, using some high school math lessons you probably thought you'd never use again. When a Russian radar, or multiple radars, detects even a fleeting contact, the system logs the bearing, altitude, and time. Plotting those detections on a map creates a track. Extending that track backward projects a cone of probability toward the likely launch origin. The more narrow the cone, the Beaver had been painted twice, once by a Crimean early warning radar at 06 for 1 and again by a mobile S-300 acquisition radar at 06 for 9. Neither detection lasted more than 2 seconds. Neither produced a fire control solution, but together they gave Rubicon a backward bearing that pointed directly at the Ken Orchard sector. Rubicon overlaid the RVR cone with terrain analysis, dirt road density, vegetation cover, historical strike patterns, and known Ukrainian staging areas. The cone narrowed to a 20 kilometers corridor, exactly where the operators had launched. A second wave of Orlan 30s launched toward the exfiltration routes. FPV teams repositioned to cover bridges and canal crossings. Somewhere in that corridor, 3 Ukrainians were hiding in a collapsed barn, waiting for the hunt to move on. The net was tightening, and the operators couldn't warn the drone, even if they wanted to, because any transmission would give Rubicon exactly what it needed. At 0700 hours, the Beaver's flight computer registered a GPS anomaly. The signal strength dropped from 5 satellites to 3, then flickered to 2. The navigation solution degraded from some meter accuracy to a 50 meters error circle that jumped erratically across the map. Russian electronic warfare had found the corridor. The Zettel system you see here operates from truck-mounted platforms positioned along likely UAV approach routes. Its directional antennas broadcast GPS jamming in the L1 and LDA bands, creating noise cones that extend 30 to 50 kilometers. The jamming doesn't destroy the drone. It degrades the navigation accuracy and, more importantly, creates pressure on the operators to break radio silence. This is because of the 4 directional emitters mounted on a hydraulic mast that extends 12 meters above the vehicle. Each emitter broadcasts a 500W jamming signal in a 60 cone, and the system can rotate to cover a full 360 arc or concentrate all 4 emitters on a single bearing for maximum power. The jamming works by flooding the GPS frequencies with noise that overwhelms the weak satellite signals. GPS satellites transmit at just 20 watts from 20,000 kilometers away, so even modest interference can drown them out. The Zettel's effective range depends on terrain and atmospheric conditions, but under optimal circumstances, it can degrade navigation accuracy for any drone within 50 kilometers of the antenna. Tonight, 3 Zettel vehicles were positioned along the Korean approach corridor, their coverage zones overlapping to create a continuous jamming blanket that the Beaver couldn't avoid. The Beaver's flight computer switched to ensign mode. Drift began accumulating immediately, 0.35 meters per minute, compounding with every passing second. Over the next hour, the drone would wander nearly a kilometer off its program course. That error was still recoverable during terminal guidance, but only if the operators could re-establish contact and correct the approach. Back at the barn, the team monitored their relay station status panel. The Beaver was beyond direct radio range as it continued to close in on the Russian MiG, and the mid-course phase required complete emission silence. They had no way to correct the navigation drift or even know if the drone was still flying. All they could do was wait for the terminal phase and hope the drone arrived close enough to the target for optical guidance to work. But while they were worried about this, Russian FPV hunter teams were still searching. At 0700 for hours, an FPV passed within 400 meters of the barn. The operator watched its thermal camera feed sweep across the structure, pause for 2 seconds, then continue east. The barn's collapsed roof had created an irregular thermal profile that masked the truck hidden inside. The blankets had cooled to ambient temperature. The team had stopped breathing. The FPV moved on. Rubicon was not trying to shoot down the Beaver. Russian commanders understood that long-range composite drones routinely defeat short-range air defense systems. The radar cross-section is too small, the flight altitude too variable, the approach vectors too unpredictable. Shooting down one drone meant nothing if 10 more launched tomorrow. But trained operators were irreplaceable. The months of discipline required to execute a mission like this, the silent launches, the perfect exfiltration, the calm under pressure could not be mass-produced. Rubicon's entire doctrine centered on one calculation: eliminate the human and the drone program goes down with them. At 07-1, the team restarted the truck. The engine had cooled enough to reduce its thermal signature below detection threshold. They rolled out of the barn and turned south, away from the search pattern toward a safe house 14 kilometers away. The Beaver was now 180 kilometers from Kacha airfield. Terminal phase would begin in less than 40 minutes. At 07:59, the Beaver crossed into Ukrainian airspace, now roughly 100 kilometers from the MiG. Its onboard computer activated the optical guidance camera and began transmitting a narrow beam uplink toward the relay station hidden in Ukraine-controlled territory. For the first time in 2 hours, the operators could see what the drone saw. The video feed was grainy, compressed for bandwidth, degraded by atmospheric interference, jittering with the 120 millisecond latency that made fine corrections feel sluggish. But the Kacha airfield was there, a gray smear of runways and revetments resolving slowly. As the Beaver descended toward attack altitude, the operator identified the target: a MiG-29 parked in a concrete shelter with its nose visible beyond the blast walls. He began steering corrections. Rubicon detected the uplink instantly. That's because the Beaver's terminal guidance system uses a directional antenna to minimize detection. But even a tightly focused beam produces side lobe leakage, stray or F energy that spills beyond the main transmission path. Russian signet rays along the Korean coast are calibrated to detect exactly this signature. Within 4 seconds, Rubicon had a bearing. Within 8 seconds, they had triangulated the relay station's approximate position. If you look at how Russian detection finding works, you'll understand why even a narrow beam uplink can't hide. Rubicon operates a network of passive receivers along the Crimean coastline, each station equipped with circular antenna arrays that measure the phase difference of incoming signals across multiple elements. When the Beaver's uplink activated, 3 stations detected the side load leakage simultaneously. Each station generated a bearing line toward the transmission source, where those 3 lines intersected on the map. Rubicon had a grid coordinate accurate to within 200 meters. The entire process from first detection to firing solution took 11 seconds. By the time the Ukrainian operator completed his first steering correction, Rubicon already knew where to shoot. The bearing pointed back toward Croissant, directly along the corridor where the FPV teams had been searching for the past 2 hours. Rubicon fired everything: FPV drones along the triangulated bearing, a Lancer-loading munition toward the most likely vehicle route, artillery coordinates to the nearest battery for fire mission approval. The operators had no idea any of this was happening. They were focused entirely on the camera feed, watching the MiG-29 grow larger in the frame, making micro-corrections to align the Beaver's nose with the aircraft's cockpit. Latency made every input feel delayed. The drone responded a heartbeat after the command, forcing the operator to anticipate rather than react. At 08:05, an artillery shell landed kilometers behind the safe house. The team froze. The relay station signal strength held steady. The shell had missed the antenna, but Rubicon had their grid coordinates now, and more shells were coming. The operator forced himself to ignore the explosions and focus on the screen. The Beaver was kilometers from target, 90 seconds to impact. A second shell landed 1,000 meters east. The team security element reported FPV drones inbound from the north. 3 contacts closing fast. The operator checked the camera feed. The INS drift accumulated during the Zeidel jamming had pushed the Beaver 340 meters left of the aim point. At the current heading, the drone would miss the revetment entirely and slam into an empty taxiway. He needed one correction, a 3-heading adjustment that would take less than 2 seconds to transmit. He sent it. The operator kept steering. The MiG-29 filled the camera frame. 60 seconds now. As the Beaver drone began its terminal dive, the 3 Russian FPV drones screamed toward the transmission source at 140 km/h. On Rubicon's tactical display, the bearing lines converged on a bombed-out apartment complex 14 kilometers south of the original search area, exactly where the triangulation said the Ukrainians were broadcasting. The lead FPV dove at a 60 angle, its camera locked onto a structure with a makeshift antenna array visible on the roof. The pilot didn't hesitate. At this stage of the hunt, speed mattered more than confirmation. The first drone struck the antenna housing dead center. The fragmentation charge detonated, shredding the transmitter array and collapsing the roof section onto the equipment below. The second FPV hit 2 seconds later, punching through the already damaged structure and detonating inside. The third impacted the north wall, ensuring nothing inside survived. Rubicon's tactical officer watched the feed go white with each explosion. 3 direct hits. The transmission source was destroyed. Artillery continued falling around the grid coordinate for another 60 seconds, turning the rubble into dust. When the barrage lifted, nothing remained of the structure but scattered concrete and twisted metal. Thermal imaging showed no movement or heat signatures. Rubicon logged the mission as a successful mission. The Ukrainian drone team had been neutralized. Whatever the Beaver did now, it was flying without guidance. A dumb missile drifting on corrupted navigation. No longer a threat. But Rubicon had made one assumption that cost them everything. They assumed the operators were there. The 3-man team was a kilometer south inside a basement with no antenna, no transmission equipment, and no RF signature. The relay had been remote operated from the moment they set it up. A deliberate sacrifice position in a separate structure precisely because Rubicon was set to target any transmission source. The operators were never closer than 500 meters from the equipment the FPBS just took out, and the final heading correction was already uploaded. The Beaver's flight computer had the new course saved. No need for outside help anymore. That 3 adjustment had centered the MiG-29 just before the relay went dark. The drone was on its own now. At 8 hours 6 minutes and 34 seconds, the Beaver hit the MiG-29 with a 20 kilograms payload. The KC-6-shaped charge hit hard, ripping through the fighter's aluminum skin. The cockpit exploded, igniting aviation fuel and sending a massive fireball into the sky. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was a charred wreck. See ya!